Chapter 5. Brexit Gridlock. As I walked up Downing Street on the Sunday after the 2017 general election, I was extremely nervous. The press standing outside number 10 shouted questions at me as I knocked on the door to see the Prime Minister. They must have noticed I looked on edge, no doubt assuming I was dreading my fate in the cabinet reshuffle that was sure to follow. But I had something more immediate on my mind. I was trying not to throw up. Whether it was the grueling pace of an election campaign, or a combination of stress and exhaustion, I had found myself falling quite badly ill by polling day. I felt so bad at the election count that my agent had to read my speech for me on stage after I was declared the winner in my constituency. Meanwhile, I was throwing up in one of the gyms at Linsport, the King's Lynn Leisure Centre, where this exercise in democracy for my voters in southwest Norfolk was reaching its conclusion. I then continued to be sick all the way from Norfolk to London. Thus, the traditional parade in front of the waiting cameras on Downing Street was even worse than usual. Usually, during a reshuffle, the Prime Minister invites you into the Cabinet Room to be told of your appointment. But on this occasion, I was led upstairs to the Margaret Thatcher study on the first floor to wait. I correctly interpret this as a bad sign. Theresa May joined me in the study, and she was moving me to be Chief Secretary to the Treasury, a more junior post and technically outside the Cabinet. Albeit with an entitlement to attend Cabinet meetings, it was a significant demotion. This was not a complete surprise, given that it had been briefed to the past couple of weeks that I was told her that I was not happy about it. I reminded her of my warning of turbulence over my reforms at the Ministry of Justice and her pledge to back me on them. She said that was not the only reason, and I realized there was no point in prolonging the awkward conversation. Before I left Downing Street, I had to see the Cabinet Office official responsible for the mechanics of ministerial appointments, Sue Gray. To my surprise, she took it upon herself to commiserate me with giving me a hug, before telling me that as a result of my demotion, my salary was being cut. I didn't welcome her unsolicited embrace. I am not a hugger, but given how delicate I was feeling, she got off lightly. I was frustrated that my time at the Ministry of Justice was being cut short. All the things I had done, from sorting out prisons to trying to get a handle on judicial appointments, had been predicted on my being in the job for a while. The idea was to do the difficult tasks first, after which things would start to get better. I didn't think I would be removed after less than a year, but as is so often the case in government, the game of musical chairs propels you elsewhere before you have a chance to do all you wanted to do. In fact, I had known my days as Lord Chancellor were numbered for several weeks. As we sat around the cabinet table on the 17th of April 2017, Theresa had taken most of us by surprise by announcing she decided to call an early election to secure a renewed mandate and stronger majority ahead of the Brexit negotiations that lay ahead. I felt a wrench in my gut the moment she announced it. Something felt wrong. Even though we were leading Labour by over 20 points in the opinion polls, and Theresa's own satisfaction ratings dwarfed those of opposition leader Jeremy Corbyn. I knew in that moment that I was toast as Justice Secretary. The controversies over appointments and the constant briefing against me by the judiciary made me an obvious candidate for the sack when, as was expected, Theresa stormed to a landslide victory in the election. Number 10 had not exactly given me unqualified support, and was clear what that meant. This made it a pretty miserable election campaign for me, as I found myself totally frozen out by the powers that be. I was relegated to the back row in cabinet appearances and kept away from the media. My special advisors kept telling me not to worry, that it was nothing personal, but I knew it was. As it happened, I wasn't the only one having a bad time. At the start of the campaign, Theresa was in a commanding position, but as it got underway, she was shown to be increasingly ill at ease in public, with stilted campaign events and awkward media appearances, an embarrassing U-turn over a pledge made in the Conservative Party manifesto on social care exemplified the confusion, and our poll lead shrank. This culminated in a shock result, with Corbyn's Labour Party capitalising on its status as the underdog to perform much better than expected. Instead of the landslide predicted at the start, we lost our overall majority, leaving us dependent on the voters of the Democratic Unionist parties, then MPs, to stay in power. Given the object of the election had been to strengthen our position in Parliament, it was little short of a disaster. In these circumstances, Theresa was in a much weakened position, and it was unclear whether she would be able to remain as leader for much longer. Her planned major cabinet reshuffle, in which it was rumoured she would have sacked her Chancellor, was shelved. For my part, I was told by someone close to her that she had won the unexpected victory. I too would have to be fired altogether. Instead, she only felt able to demote me, in one of the few changes she made. The irony was that I always wanted to be in the Treasury, and although this was not the role I had envisioned, I did at least have a strong interest in the subject. Environment and justice were interesting briefs, but I hadn't gone into politics to deal with floods or fix prisons. Now I was able to get stuck into something I was driven by, economic policy, which was a silver lining. The experience of being demoted, after a bruising period in a senior job, changed my outlook on politics. Up to that point, I had tried to behave myself, play the game, and do the right thing. Now, having only just avoided being sacked outright, I had nothing much to lose. I decided I was going to say what I thought and stop worrying so much about the consequences. I adopted a more irreverent style on social media, moving away from the slavish retweeting of government slogans and instead having some fun with it. I was more honest about what I believed, perhaps a little too honest at times. I upset my cabinet colleagues by publicly criticising their unconservative policies of general banning and taxing things. At this point, my colleagues seemed to be in overdrive to make Britain uncompetitive. They introduced new environmental regulations, banning plastic straws and wood-burning stoves. I was surprised much of this was coming from Brexiteers. I couldn't understand the logic of freeing ourselves from the shackles of Europe only to impose more regulations in Britain. But my new era wasn't just a change in style. My experience in the Ministry of Justice had radicalized me. I saw how the establishment operated to freeze out change. It saw how the establishment didn't seem to get the possibility to get the things right done through the system. It was a case of go along with the status quo or get crushed. My new boss at the Treasury, the Chancellor Philip Hammond, was the archetypal of an ultra-cautious, risk-adverse establishment figure. His main preoccupation was stopping the Prime Minister and others from spending too much money. On this, we agreed. But while we rubbed along, we had differing views on the dominant issue of the moment, Brexit. As he put it to me on one occasion, he disagreed with my Welsh and Heidhoch worldview, despite having made Eurosceptic noises earlier in his career. He was now a signed-up member of the Treasury's EU exit damage limitation exercise. Pretty much the entire Treasury was working to keep the UK closely aligned with the EU, maintaining similar regulations and approaches. In all his public utterances, Philip gave the impression he thought Brexit was a terrible idea and needed to be mitigated by all means possible. I thought the opposite. I favoured a clean break. We had crossed the Rubicon. The British people had voted for it, and we needed to get on with it. There was no option of being half in and half out that didn't make us subservient to Brussels. We needed to use the opportunities of Brexit to revitalise Britain's economy and democracy, and the EU was skeleton. So there were lots of opportunities. Our differences reflected a split right down the middle of the Conservative Party. A further 20 or so MPs didn't want Brexit to happen at all. I looked across the Atlantic for inspiration as to how Britain's prospects could be transferred by removing the shackles of EU laws and trade rules. I visited Washington, D.C., Cleveland, Ohio, and Detroit, Michigan, to see how President Trump was delivering tax cuts and a regulatory rollback that was spurring the American economy. Alas, my attempts to include Green Bay, Wisconsin on the itinerary were thwarted by Treasury officials and the British Embassy in Washington. I liked the go-getting, self-reliant nature of the vision. I met Nirmio Rao, Trump's regulatory czar, who told me about how they were rolling back all of the Obama's era's regulations. I saw opportunity zones and free ports that were bringing in a new investment in business. I saw the manufacturing industry getting ahead on cheap fracked gas. The rollbacks of Obama-era regulations were clearly working. Patronizing people was over. This was exactly what we needed in Britain to win over the new voters who had supported Brexit and wanted their towns and cities to be great again. But back at home, the Treasury and Whitehall were intent on trying to manage the fallout and patch things up with Europe, rather than looking for new opportunities, even though their own analysis suggested the biggest opportunity of Brexit was a trade deal with the US, alongside abolishing the EU's Working Time Directive, which told people how long they were allowed to work. I was packed off to Luxembourg to deputise for Philip at a meeting of European finance ministers. I felt like I was at a wake as the corpse. All of them were so sad that Britain was leaving the club. All, that is, except for the French finance minister, who pointedly ignored me. I gave full vent to my vision of Britain as Singapore-on-Thames and suggested the entire continent needed to become more competitive. This seemed to come as a shock to the Treasury officials with me. Although I think the local representative had some sympathy, I was not asked to deputise for the Chancellor again. In the Treasury, as across the rest of government, Brexit was a fault line that was constantly having to be pampered over to maintain the pretense that the government was united on the way ahead. No one really believed that. Instead, following the 2017 general election debacle, we were set on a course for 2 years of increasing chaos and parliamentary gridlock. My cabinet colleague, Andrea Leadsom, the leader of the House of Commons, formed the Pizza Club, a group of us who favoured a clean break from the EU. We would get together in her office, sometimes with actual pizzas, and talk about how we could get Brexit done. It was more like a therapy session than anything else. At one point, during the interminable Brexit negotiations, Theresa opened a meeting of the cabinet by informing us that our discussion on the topic was not intended to reach firm conclusions that day. "This is not a decision-making cabinet," she announced. How right she was. Reaching agreement with the EU was one thing, but keeping together an increasingly fractious Conservative Party and securing a majority in Parliament was quite another. Her tentative attitude made for slow progress, and it was never really clear what her views were on where the deal should land. At one of the biggest moments in our country's history, when we needed a firm vision and bold leadership, we had an ultra-cautious Prime Minister and an ultra-cautious Chancellor. At a time when bold decisions were needed, we had a government that seemed averse to making any. I had, to some extent, been insulted from the wider Brexit psychodrama while I had been at the Ministry of Justice, because of the all-consuming nature of the job. But as Chief Secretary, I was under less intense pressure, and the work of stewarding the public finances and resisting public spending demands was more in my comfort zone. I therefore had more time to involve myself in the wider politics of the moment. As time went on, I became more and more frustrated at the lack of boldness. Brexit was always going to be a tough negotiation, and we needed to approach it from a position of strength. In any negotiation, you have to be willing to walk away. That meant having the credible threat that we would be willing to go for no deal with the EU. But just as with David Cameron in his underwhelming renegotiation before the referendum, that threat was simply not there. Theresa clearly was not going to walk away from the talks, and the EU knew it. It was hard to discern what Theresa's view of Brexit was. She had campaigned somewhat half-heartedly for Remain. She gave the impression of not being an enthusiast one way or the other. Her focus was always on mitigating downside risk, not looking at the opportunities. She was a cautious and technocratic manager, not one for making bold political gambles. Even if she were, the 2017 general election had boxed her into a corner. The party was in a fractious state, and she did not command a united view in cabinet, let alone in the parliamentary party. This left us negotiating among ourselves rather than negotiating with the EU. My own view was that we should have been much more hard-headed about the negotiations from the outset. The UK's decision to leave was always going to be seen by the EU as an act of war. That being the case, you have to proceed on that basis. The only thing they understand is pain. We should have told them that we were prepared to go for no deal, put tariffs on their agricultural imports, and pursue a trade agreement with the US. The truth is we potentially had a lot of leverage, but we never used it. That was a persistent frustration for me. When you have a Prime Minister and a Chancellor both keen to listen to cautious civil servants, that sort of bold, bellicose approach was never going to fly. Once again, it is hard not to conclude that the logical and best outcome in 2016 would have been for Boris Johnson to have become Prime Minister and forced Brexit with a combination of aggressive brinksmanship and political chutzpah. This he eventually did in 2019, but only after we had endured 3 painful years of gridlock under Theresa. There was no shortage of grandstanding and tough talking during that time, but without a robust position to back it up, they were just hollow words. The old political maxim is to speak softly and carry a big stick. Between 2016 and 2019, the government was often shouting while waving a twig. In July 2018, the cabinet was summoned to the Prime Minister's country house, Chequers, where we were asked to endorse the outline of a deal that Theresa would seek to agree with the EU. The room was set up with round tables as if we were attending a wedding. At the time, this was seen as a make-or-break meeting at which a united position would finally be reached. In the event, it was something of a damp squib. I recall a barbecue with some rather undercooked chicken. The Chequers proposal was an attempt at a compromise aligning with EU rules in the short term while ensuring a future government would be able to divulge. It was clear this later divergence would have consequences, as the plan itself stated, possibly in the form of tariffs or additional friction at the border. Needless to say, this compromise pleased nobody. A Chuck Chequers campaign immediately started, and in the days afterwards, a succession of ministers resigned from the government. Firstly, Brexit Secretary David Davis, and then Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson. I was willing to back this very messy agreement because I feared the alternative of not leaving at all. The noises from wet Conservative MPs and their friends in the media and the establishment were getting louder. Not leaving would have been a disaster, as well as being completely undemocratic and a national humiliation. It would have resulted in several electoral punishment for the Conservatives at the ballot box. From now on, it was a slow and painful descent into an even worse division and gridlock. There were interminable cabinet meetings. Some of my colleagues were placing bets on how long another would speak for. Normally, no one leaves a cabinet meeting during proceedings. Yet during this time, one colleague's regular lengthy monologues became the cue for other ministers to leave the room for comfort breaks. In the months that followed, the government completely lost control of the parliamentary agenda. That December, Theresa survived a no-confidence vote on her leadership by MPs, but the writing was on the wall. As we entered 2019, a number of colleagues joined me in again making the case for no deal. By that point, it was the only roll of the dice left to play, and in my view, the only way we could get a successful outcome. As the 31st of March deadline approached, I was clear with the Prime Minister that the only option she had for the sake of the country, the party, and herself, in that order, was to go for a no-deal Brexit. Others piled on. It was very clear that Nigel Farage's Brexit party would make mincemeat of us if the UK ended up participating in the European Parliament elections due to take place that May, because we hadn't managed to leave the EU in time. Faced with the prospect of no deal, the opposition parties and Tory Remainers united to thwart that option, and the Prime Minister in any case was not prepared to entertain the idea herself. Again, the EU could see every faltering footstep of our integral wrangling and knew we were playing with a broken bat. In late 2018, Theresa had struck a deal with the EU that was not dissimilar to the flawed Chequers deal. It left the UK as a rule taker over large areas of EU law, locked us in a customs union without the ability to leave, undermined the integrity of the union by creating internal borders within the UK, and left the European Court of Justice with the whip hand over the agreement. Again, it was far from optimal, but I was swayed by Attorney General Geoffrey Cox's argument that we should do the deal in order to get at least the raft into the open sea, as he put it. We could always revisit it in due course. It was kicking the can down the road, but at least the can would be moving. 3 times the deal was put to the MPs, and 3 times it was rejected, in no small part because Labour refused to back it. I had found it especially galling to see cabinet colleagues going cap in hand to Corbyn and Sir Keir Starmer, his Brexit spokesperson, begging them to back the government. It was a mistaken strategy that I strongly opposed, but cabinet ministers like Gove and Hammond were determined to pursue this course of action. Whole books can be and have been written about the chaos of this unhappy period, marked by all sorts of parliamentary shenanigans and infighting. But the basic point was simple. A broad coalition of Remainers in the Conservative Party, the opposition, and bureaucratic establishment tried their hardest to water down Brexit, while ultra-Brexiteers, on the other side, rejected every deal on the table and refused to give an inch. To my mind, the issue was black or white. We could either be in the EU or be completely out of it. The worst position would have been to remain in a semi-detached state, unable to gain any of the benefits of leaving while the EU made things as hard for us as possible. That was where we risked ending up. Yet for the Conservative Party, it had been a lucky escape. If a deal had been done with Labour, it would have split our party down the middle and caused a potentially fatal schism. I would have had to rebel at that point. I was not willing to defy the will of the country and my constituents. Theresa was a competent administrator, and in a quieter time in politics, she might have been seen as a strong and stable leader, to coin a phrase. But amid a fundamental change for the country, when bold decisions needed to be made, she simply did not have the instincts to play hardball with her party or the EU. The decision to hold an election in 2017 was logical on its own terms, but the poor result crippled the party and put the government at the mercy of others. She did not have the strength she needed, and the EU was calling the shots. By the time we found ourselves in the ludicrous position of having to run candidates in a European Parliament election because we hadn't succeeded in leaving by the deadline, her position was untenable. In retrospect, and I feel qualified to say this, she did well to cling to office for as long as she did, but for what purpose? Ever since Boris resigned from the cabinet in the wake of the Chequers meeting, it was inevitable that he would at some point mount a leadership challenge. Having backed him in 2016, I was sympathetic to him and was increasingly of the worldview that he was the only person who could provide the necessary shock to the system and break the deadlock and actually deliver Brexit. As the government went into meltdown in the early months of 2019, his phone calls to me and other colleagues got more frequent, and he was soon joined by other contenders as they jockeyed for position for what looked like an inevitable leadership challenge. The trickle of ministerial resignations became a flood, but I was not seriously tempted to join them. Rightly or wrongly, I thought it was better to stay on the inside and try to force progress from there. By the time the wheels really came off, it was clear the government was doomed, and my joining the exodus would have made a material difference. When Theresa eventually bowed to the inevitable of the eve of the disastrous European election results, where the Brexit Party triumphed, the leadership race began in earnest. Bizarrely, as it all kicked off, I was sitting in a field in Hay-on-Wye, attending a slightly lefty philosophical festival where I had been booked to give a speech. A flood of phone calls came in from the likes of Dominic Raab, Gove, and Andrea Leadsom. As they sought my support for their leadership ambitions, there was no way I was going to support Gove after his betrayal of Boris last time around. I had also since grown appalled over his manoeuvring to thwart a hard Brexit. Some intriguing offers were floated to entice me to support one candidate or another, but I had pretty much decided to back Boris. As I spoke to other colleagues, including Rishi Sunak, it became clear that they were coming to the same conclusion. When I spoke to Boris himself, he was as charming and animated as ever, and I agreed to join his team. After my public declaration, I got stuck into helping thrash out his platform, and I was encouraged to see signs of the bold approach that had been so lacking over the previous few years. After the usual soap opera of Westminster politics during the MPs' voting rounds, the contest went to the Conservative membership across the country. It became clear that Boris would prevail over Jeremy Hunt, his successor as Foreign Secretary, who was effectively the continuity candidate of the political establishment. To my mind, we had tested the idea of overly cautious compromise to destruction, and I had no appetite for more of the same. As for my own prospectus, it was no great secret that my ambition at this time was to be Chancellor, but I knew there was little chance I would be offered the job, which was pretty much nailed for me by Sajid Javid. I thought, however, that I might be given a strong economic brief and had been expecting business secretary. So when Boris called me to number 10 after his victory, I walked up Downing Street with rather more of a spring in my step than 2017 and without the fear that I might vomit. I was surprised to be offered the job of International Trade Secretary, and I was initially slightly worried. Was it a real job? The previous incumbent, Liam Fox, had frankly little to do while the Brexit talks dragged on and not been allowed to start negotiating trade deals until the withdrawal agreement with the EU was in place. I had always thought this was a massive missed opportunity, and I was keen not to be in a similar position of sitting on the sidelines, twiddling my thumbs. Would I be allowed to get on with it? Boris assured me I would. I was also worried about being away from home a lot and actually burst into tears the minute I got back to my house that evening and saw my daughters. But in truth, I loved the job. There was a dynamic permanent security in Antonio Romero, and the second permanent secretary, Crawford Faulkner, was a sardonic Kiwi who had been hired for trade negotiations. I was pleased to be back as a full cabinet minister after 2 years of sitting on the naughty step at the far end of the cabinet table. But most of all, I was excited by the prospect that we would now, to quote Boris's campaign slogan, get Brexit done. The government had been paralysed for months after more than 2 years of infighting and painfully slow progress. Now 3 years after the British people had voted for a dramatic shift away from the EU, it was well past time for that mandate to be delivered. Boris was the ideal person to do it. He was a great showman, charismatic and engaging, and had shown during the referendum campaign that he could connect brilliantly with those who felt left behind by the political establishment in Westminster and Brussels. They recognised in him a maverick who would shake things up and cut through the diplomatic niceties to call it as he saw it. Compromises or comparisons with Trump are overly simplistic, but just as in the US, we saw as unconventional and often controversial leader appealing to disengaged voters in a way that others struggle to match and whom opponents fail to understand. In retrospect, and with the benefit of my subsequent experience in number 10, the painful experience of the Theresa May years proved important. The lesson I took from it at the time was the lack of boldness in seizing the moment left a government directionless and at the mercy of events. That was certainly true. But beneath the surface, there were signs about how powerful the resistance to a serious shake-up in Britain was. The establishment did not like disruptive political initiatives that did not accord with their worldview. Brexit had crashed through the cosy centrist consensus of the British establishment, and the establishment pushed back. From the opposition parties in Parliament to parts of the Conservative Party, there were outright defiance of the expressed will of the British people. But just as significant was the more subtle opposition from within the government and the official machine itself, aided and abetted by their friends in the financial markets and the legal world. The foreign policy establishment had ignored the rise of Trump and failed to make any progress with our main alternative trading partner. These interests made concerted efforts to water down Brexit, urging caution about playing hardball with the EU, pushing for closer alignment, and trying to rule out no deal at all costs. This fatally undercut the government's negotiation position from the outset. What I should have learned from this was how these powerful interests can work together to frame the choices available to the government, embedding groupthink at all levels and making radical action seem unthinkable. In the months after he entered Number 10, Boris's bold attempts to break from this approach met with huge resistance and were nearly derailed. Europhile MPs from both sides of the House conspired to take control of the Order paper, the House of Commons agenda, to stop Brexit. Boris then prologued Parliament to stop them from doing this. He was then challenged in court by a group of Europhiles, and the Supreme Court ruled in their favour. It was only by calling a general election and winning an unequivocal mandate that he was finally able to prevail, and it is a testament to his political skills that he was able to do so. But his success should not erase the memory of just how hard others fought to thwart him, both inside and outside the government. The other relic of this period was a fractious and febrile Conservative parliamentary party. The Brexit referendum had unleashed and normalised infighting. Factions openly attacked one another in public and conspired and plotted behind the scenes. Once discipline is lost, it is very hard for it to be restored, if it ever can be. I cannot help but think that the increased propensity of the party to dump its leaders in the years since 2016 has been a result of this ingrained disunity. Theresa May was its first victim. She will not be its last.